Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Just a few days ago, something pretty dramatic happened in Washington. President Donald Trump abruptly removed his Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, from one of the most powerful positions in the federal government. In the same announcement, he nominated Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin to take over the Department of Homeland Security. The change is expected to take effect at the end of March, pending confirmation by the United States Senate. At first glance, the story looks like a fairly straightforward Washington controversy. There was a congressional hearing. Lawmakers grilled the secretary about a controversial government advertising campaign. The campaign reportedly cost about $220 million and focused on border security messaging. Critics in Congress argued that taxpayer money had been used not just to promote border policy, but to promote Noem herself. The ads featured her prominently, sometimes even dramatically riding horseback along the border in what looked almost like a Western movie. But in Washington politics, stories that look simple on the surface often have deeper layers, and the more you look at this episode, the more it begins to look less like a simple scandal about an expensive advertising campaign and more like something else, a classic power adjustment inside a presidential administration. To understand what happened, we need to step back and look at the broader political context. The Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, is one of the largest and most complex federal agencies in the United States. It oversees border enforcement, immigration operations, disaster response, cybersecurity, and much more. In a Trump administration, however, DHS carries an additional level of political significance. That's because immigration and border security have always been central themes of Trump's political identity. From his first presidential campaign to his second term in office, border security has been one of the defining issues of his presidency. So whoever runs DHS doesn't just manage a bureaucracy, they help represent one of the core narratives of the administration, and that's where the situation with Kristi Noem becomes particularly interesting. Over the past year, Noem had become one of the most visible faces of the administration's border policy. She frequently traveled to the southern border. She appeared in media interviews. She led press tours with reporters and law enforcement officers. She posted videos about border enforcement operations and immigration crackdowns. In many ways, she built a strong personal brand around the issue of border security. Now, in politics, visibility can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, presidents want energetic cabinet officials who can defend their policies and communicate with the public. But on the other hand, in a presidential system, especially one centered around a highly visible political leader, there is an unspoken rule: the main political spotlight ultimately belongs to the president. This is not unique to Trump. It's a pattern that appears in many administrations throughout history. Cabinet secretaries can be powerful, influential, and effective, but if their public profile begins to rival or overshadow the president's narrative on a key issue, tensions can emerge. And immigration, of course, is not just any issue. It is perhaps the most symbolic policy arena of Trump's political brand. That brings us back to the advertising campaign that triggered the controversy. According to reports and congressional testimony, the Department of Homeland Security launched a massive communications initiative designed to highlight border enforcement policies and discourage illegal migration. The campaign reportedly cost about $220 million, which is an enormous amount of money, even by federal standards. Government agencies do run public awareness campaigns, but once the price tag climbs into the hundreds of millions, members of Congress start asking very hard questions. During a recent congressional hearing, lawmakers pressed Noem about the campaign's cost and messaging. They questioned whether the ads were truly about public policy, or whether they were designed to enhance the secretary's own political image. The fact that Noem herself appeared prominently in the advertisements made the optics even more controversial. At one point during the hearing, the conversation took a particularly awkward turn. Noem suggested that the campaign had been approved by the president. Later, however, Trump publicly indicated that he had not personally signed off on the details of the advertising initiative. That discrepancy immediately created political tension. If the secretary claimed the president approved the ads, but the president said he didn't know about them, then somebody was clearly out of alignment. In Washington, situations like that rarely end quietly. But here's the key point. The hearing itself was probably not the real reason Noem lost her job. Hearings happen all the time in Washington. Cabinet officials are questioned, criticized, and sometimes embarrassed. That alone usually isn't enough to end a career. Instead, the hearing likely served as a catalyst, a moment that exposed deeper concerns that had already been building behind the scenes. Those concerns likely had more to do with political narrative and internal power dynamics than with advertising budgets. In a presidential administration, messaging discipline is extremely important. When a policy issue becomes closely associated with one particular cabinet official, it can subtly shift public perception of who is leading that policy. And if the issue in question is one of the president's signature themes, that shift can become politically sensitive. Seen through that lens, the advertising campaign may have crossed an invisible line. Instead of simply promoting border policy, the ads appeared to elevate the secretary herself as a central figure in the story. Whether that was intentional or not, it changed the optics. In politics, optics matter. Now let's talk about the person nominated to replace her. Senator Markwayne Mullin. Mullin is an interesting figure in his own right. A senator from the state of Oklahoma, he is a member of the Cherokee Nation and one of the relatively few Native American senators in modern U.S. history. Before entering politics, he ran a family plumbing and construction business. At one point, he even competed as a professional mixed martial arts fighter. In the Senate, Mullin has been a strong ally of Trump and a vocal supporter of tough border enforcement policies. His political style tends to emphasize toughness, loyalty, and a blue-collar background qualities that align well with the populist image that has defined much of the Trump movement. If the Senate confirms his nomination, he would become the new head of DHS and the public face of the administration's immigration enforcement strategy. But an important question remains. What happens to Kristi Noem now? Some observers initially interpreted her reassignment as a political demotion. However, the situation may actually be more complicated than that. Instead of simply leaving the administration, Noem has reportedly been appointed to a new role known as the Special Envoy for the Shield of the Americas. At first glance, that title sounds somewhat vague. And in Washington, special envoy positions can vary enormously in influence. Some envoys hold relatively ceremonial roles with limited authority. Others become key players in international diplomacy and security coordination. So there are really two possible interpretations of this new job. The first possibility is that it's mostly symbolic, a way to move a prominent political figure out of a cabinet position without pushing her completely out of the administration. In Washington terms, that would be a relatively soft landing. But there is also a second possibility, and it's a much more interesting one. The Shield of the Americas role could involve coordinating security policy across the Western Hemisphere. That might include cooperation on migration routes, regional law enforcement efforts, and diplomatic initiatives involving countries in Central and South America, issues like migration networks through Central America, security partnerships with regional governments, and political developments in places like Cuba or Venezuela could all fall within that portfolio. If the administration is planning a major initiative focused on the Western Hemisphere, especially concerning migration flows and regional stability, then the envoy position could actually become quite significant. And there is historical precedent for that kind of transformation. One of the most famous examples in American government is the role of National Security Advisor. Today, it is considered one of the most powerful positions in Washington. But that wasn't always the case. When the role first existed decades ago, it wasn't viewed as a central power position. It gained prominence largely because of the influence of one individual, Henry Kissinger. When Kissinger served as National Security Advisor during the administration of Richard Nixon, he transformed the position. Through his personal relationship with the president and his involvement in major diplomatic initiatives, including the historic opening between the United States and China during the Cold War. Kissinger turned the National Security Advisor into a core decision-making role at the very center of American foreign policy. In other words, the power of a position sometimes depends less on its formal title and more on how the person holding it chooses to use it. The same could theoretically be true for the Shield of the Americas envoy role. If Noem becomes deeply involved in shaping Western Hemisphere policy, especially on migration, security cooperation, and regional diplomacy, the position could evolve into something far more influential than it appears on paper, and timing may matter as well. If the Trump administration is preparing to address complex issues involving Cuba or other regional actors, the envoy could play a coordinating role between the White House, the State Department, and security agencies. So while her departure from DHS is certainly a major political moment, it may not necessarily mark the end of her influence within the administration. Ultimately, what this entire episode illustrates is how fluid power can be inside any presidential government. Cabinet positions are powerful, but they are also inherently political. Leaders rise, roles change, and sometimes officials move into new positions where their influence takes a different form. For President Trump, the decision to replace the head of DHS likely reflects a desire to recalibrate the administration's messaging and leadership structure. On one of its most defining issues, border security, for Markwayne Mullin, the nomination represents an opportunity to step into one of the most consequential security roles in the federal government. And for Kristi Noem, the new envoy position could turn out to be either a quiet sideline or the beginning of an entirely new chapter in her political career. In Washington, the real meaning of a position often depends not just on the title itself, but on the political moment and the person occupying it. As history has shown many times, the right individual in the right circumstances can transform even an obscure role into the center of power, and that's why the story of Kristi Noem may not be ending, it may simply be moving to a different stage. Thanks for watching.